I'm on a little bit of a roll video wise because it's been a while since I made videos and there's a few topics I want to talk about. Just two things I want to say. I'm going to try and do a live feed soon, possibly even this evening. I'm not sure. See how that goes. I never really schedule them just because I think being spontaneous um, gives more people an opportunity. Some people may be in other time zones, some people may be working. I just think being spontaneous is better. I mean, I've tried in the past scheduling live feeds, saying okay, there's gonna be a live feed at this time, and I may do that. So a live stream, I should say. I may try that again, but my previous experiences, it didn't really make any difference to the viewership. So that's why it's spontaneous. But if you miss one, no worries, I'll do them periodically. Um, I want to talk about reform, actually. And so unlike a lot of my videos, I'm not going to be going by any sort of particular article or anything like that. I just want to speak openly here what I think of the Reform Party, because there has been a lot of attention on Reform's recent electoral success in local elections. Um, I will say I think it's slightly overblown. I think that Reform is doing well. I think clearly Reform is picking up some support from both the Conservatives and Labour, and I don't think Reform can be dismissed. But I also think there's a bit of hyperbole going on. This idea that because Reform's done well in local elections, they're suddenly going to sweep into number 10. I think that's delusional. I mean, what do they have at the moment? Five MPs, six MPs? You don't go from that to being in government in a matter of, let's say, the next general election is in 3 or 4 years. It's not going to happen. What may happen is Reform will pick up a few more seats. I think that's plausible. They might even do significantly well, like the Liberal Democrats done in 2024. Because that's another thing, there's a lot of talk about reform. Why not more conversation about why the Liberal Democrats are doing well? I mean, I'll get to reform in a second, but just a brief word on what I believe is Labour pandering to reform at the moment. Certainly, their tougher line on legal immigration, not illegal immigration, legal immigration. I think there's Labour strategists that think we're going to lose the reform, so we have to catch up on this. And certainly, immigration is one of those big hot button topics that reform will capitalise on. Labour has to be careful that they don't polarise the left to the point where they lose left wing support, and left wing Labour voters might decide to go to the Liberal Democrats and to a less likely towards the Greens, but I think towards the Liberal Democrats would be the obvious choice. People angry about Labour's continued threats to welfare, um, the way they're acting towards disabled claimants, um, the attitude towards winter fuel allowance. In fact, that angers a lot of people. It doesn't just anger the left; it angers reform voters as well. Um, Labour really isn't doing a good job of making itself domestically popular right now. And I always say, a new government, it takes time to change things, but some of this is unjustified. Um, the first Labour government in 14 years should not be trying to go out of its way to be right wing. There's some areas I think it is necessary to understand the public mood, but in the end of the day, it is a Labour government. People want it to be a Labour government now. That having been said, this is my take on reform. Like I say, I think their success is being exaggerated. Clearly, they've done well in the local elections. They picked up, I believe, it was 575 councillors. That's significant, can't be dismissed. But they still only have five or six MPs. And the point I made in the last election, it's all very well saying, oh, reform came second in so many seats. But the point is, they came second. In all of those seats where they came second, people still felt I believe it's almost always to Labour, people still felt more confidence in the Labour candidate. Second is second. It isn't winning in our first past the post system. So, you know, clearly reform is making traction, but that's the first thing. I think their success is being exaggerated, and with that, I think it would be wrong for the government to pander solely to reform. Um, Clearly, Kimmy Badenoch's having a headache with reform at the moment. But I don't think she's overly impressive as Tory leader. She's got it right on a few issues, but I'm not overly impressed by her. I think she's not grasping that, yes, the job of the opposition is to hold the government to account, but you have to do more than just throw out insults like she done recently with the Prime Minister. Um, Her sycophantic attitude to Trump isn't very impressive. She's toned it down a little bit recently, but and Badenoch's right on things like common sense issues around the trans subject, but again, that alone isn't enough to convince someone like me to vote for the Tories. It's important, women's rights is not a trivial thing. It is important, but being anti woke is not in itself enough. So, in my view, and I don't think Badenoch or her party have fully accepted why they lost. I don't think they've fully got it. And it's not that Labour is much better, but simply saying, oh, Labour's doing this, Labour's doing that. If the Tories really want to be back in power, they have to fully recognise the anger against them, which is, reasons why they lost the election. For example, one rule for them and another rule for everyone else. That was very much the perception. I don't think Badenoch has fully understood that. Now, am I saying that Reform has picked up votes in that regard? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I would say this right now. To summarise, I agree with some of Reform's positions, but I do not trust Reform. I certainly won't be voting for Reform. Now, why do I not trust them? For one particular reason that I think probably a lot of the voters don't care that much about, but I do, because it's something that I'm deeply involved in. That is the Ukrainian diaspora here. I absolutely do not trust the Reform Party when it comes to Russia. My reasoning for that is the fact that Nigel Farage very clearly praised Putin. Now, I've seen Reform people try to justify this and try to downplay it and try to say, oh, it was taken out of context, or he didn't mean that, or he also condemned the invasion. At a time when a country is struggling with occupation, seeing its civilians massacred, when Russia is threatening nuclear war against the West, the leader of a political party in the UK to praise the Russian dictator is an absolute disgrace. I've seen people try to justify that by saying, oh, well, historians will give some credit to Roman emperors, etc., etc. Nigel Farage is not a historian. He's a party leader. With that comes certain standards. Now, when I see a party leader praising Vladimir Putin, I feel disgusted, utterly disgusted. I don't care that Farage put the caveat, oh, but it's wrong what Putin done invading Ukraine. The fact of the matter is, Farage has told Russian propaganda by blaming the West for Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. He's using the same language as Donald Trump, and it's abhorrent. It's also factually wrong. More to the point, it's factually wrong. Russia is not surrounded by NATO. The real reason for Putin's aggression is not because of NATO. The real reason for Putin's aggression is because Putin has never accepted the collapse not only of the Soviet Union but of the Tsarist Empire. That's what this is really about. So Nigel Farage, in refusing to acknowledge that, yeah, he's guilty of pushing Russian propaganda. Now, Andrew Tice has just come out and claimed that Farage regrets his views on this. Well, why can't he say that himself? Why can't Farage come out and say, I was wrong to praise Putin? Until he does, I will not trust him when it comes to Russia. And he's not the only one. There was a Reform Party candidate in the general election, thankfully did not win the seat, in Salisbury, of all places, Salisbury, praising Putin. And he said something along the lines of this isn't verbatim, but well, he's done some unpleasant things, but we can't deny he's a great leader. Now, this is absolutely brain dead regurgitating of Russian propaganda. It's sickening, actually. I think any British politician who says anything positive about Putin is not fit for office. In that case, he didn't win the seat. But how insulting. The very city that saw chemical warfare, for the very city that was threatened by Russian state aggression, to praise Putin in that way. It's abhorrent. So I do not trust the Reform Party. A little bit like right-wing MAGA types. I think the moral compass is skewed when it comes to Putin. I think actually there is a number of Reform voters who probably quite like Putin, admire Putin, because they see him as a strong man. They see him as anti-woke. I'm not going to say if you're a reform voter you support Putin. That would be a lazy argument. I know with reform voters that abhor Putin, but I think in the UK, if we were to see one political party that has Putin supporters gravitate towards it, it would be Reform. Um, and that's troubling. So it's probably my number one reason for not supporting Reform. I do not trust them when it comes to that. There's other areas of foreign policy, absolutely, when it comes to Israel and Gaza. You can be sure Reform will be 100% pro-Israel. There'll be no objectivity whatsoever there. Um, I might bring that into my video later on regarding the latest atrocity in Gaza. There's other sort of domestic things I don't entirely trust Reform on. I mean, if we think the Labour's tough on welfare and the Tories are, I dread to think what Reform would do if they got into power. Um, the only area where I would say Reform might, I can't say I'd be a hypocrite if I said I didn't have some agreement with them, is I think they do take generally a tough line on crime. I think that their attitude of the riots last year was tone deaf. I think that Farage's response to that, his first attitude was to blame immigration instead of blaming the thugs who were actually doing it. But that's much in tandem of the attitude you've been used to. They're just fed up citizens who've had enough. No, they were rioting racist thugs. Um, so reform needs to be a bit more consistent. If they claim to be the party of law and order, then they have to accept that just because people are rioting over immigration doesn't mean that it's okay. If they're claiming to be the party of law and order, that has to be consistent. Now, why I said that I support reform in some areas, it has to be said they are the only party that is supporting a national inquiry into grooming gangs. No other party has went along with that. Why not? Dr. Lawrence Newport has um, publishes findings that Reform is the only party that is going along with that completely. Other parties only have lackluster support. Now, the grooming gangs was one of the biggest scandals in this country in recent years. It did breed very deep anger and mistrust of the legal establishment, of certainly Labour run councils. So I think that if Labour doesn't recognise the anger towards that, they're definitely going to lose out to Reform. So if there is one area where I think, okay, maybe reform will hit it, I mean, we look at things, for example, judges blocking deportations of foreign criminals, tone deaf and stupid, absolutely tone deaf and stupid. And, I have been very, very vocal about my thoughts on the legal establishment. I think that's something that insults the public, endangers the public, and it's just plain wrong. And reform is really, well, I suppose you could say right wing Tories would also take a hard line on that. But yeah, Reform's really the only party that is fully dedicated to confronting that. Has to be said. But like I say, when it comes to foreign policy, another big area I should say, it's Nigel Farage himself. I don't trust him. I think he's like a salesman. I think his attitude to Donald Trump, his sycophantic attitude to Donald Trump. I mentioned Badnock is that way. No, Farage is far worse. I mean, Farage stands next to Donald Trump, grinning like a Cheshire cat. He wants to roll out the red carpet. I find it deeply pathetic. Farage vilifies the European Union and wants to, keep pushing this mantra that the EU is our enemy. Yet he wants us to be subservient to the United States. Now, of course, he'll deny that. But look at the sycophantic attitude that he takes to Trump. In fact, even lobbied to be the American ambassador. It's pathetic. I think Farage comes across as a groveling fanboy when it comes to Donald Trump. He says they're great friends. There's nothing patriotic about being subservient to the American president. There's nothing patriotic about groveling that way. Um, so I don't trust reform when it comes to America. I don't trust reform when it comes to Russia. I don't trust reform when it comes to America. The only areas I would give reform some credit is probably they will take a tougher line on crime, broadly speaking, although I think they got it wrong in last year's riots. China, I think reform will take a hard line on China. Good. The Labour government is just absolutely tone deaf on that issue. I think Labour is gambling with our national security on that issue. Again, that is something that Reform has probably got right. But there's sufficient enough areas for me to not trust Reform. I'm in no rush to vote for them. And I do think that they, of course, stopping the small boats is important. Of course, tackling illegal immigration is important. But Reform to me is part of the narrative that all immigration is bad. It's just negative, negative, negative. And they will say we're in favour of legal immigration, but I think overall the tone on immigration is too negative actually. I don't want to see foreign criminals come to this country. I don't want to see people who have Islamist ideologies or ideologies hostile to Britain coming to this country. But I don't like the idea of hammering even legal migration, immigration, I should say. Um, there could be many positive things from immigration, and I just think the overall tone has been too negative, actually. Um, so I don't think that Reform cares much about compassion, quite honestly. Right now they're talking about the winter fuel allowances and so on. They're doing that because it's politically useful. But in government, if they ever got into government, I honestly think they would be bluer than the bluest Tories when it comes to, supporting the strongest in society. What will Reform do about the homeless? What will Reform do about disabled claimants? At the moment they may criticise Labour, but fundamentally Reform is a deeply conservative party. So I just don't trust them to care about the most vulnerable in society. Of course, it's the old right wing tactic of blame the immigrant for everything, but you have to consider and look a little bit deeper. Are they going to be a party that is actually compassionate towards British citizens? I'm not sure that they will be. I think Reform is going to make traction, but I don't entirely trust them. At the moment, incidentally, I'm in a bit of a political wilderness. I'm in no rush to support anyone, quite honestly. Because at the moment, I don't fully endorse any party. I don't fully trust any party. But I also agree with most of the parties on something. So I'm not totally politically apathetic. And I don't say, oh, they're all the same. There's areas I do agree with them on. But, that's my take on Reform. I know some of my subscribers to Reform voters. Maybe you can explain to me why you'd support them. I've given my reasons. People can disagree. It's only my opinion. It's only my perception. You may have your own reasons for supporting Reform. If it's for Brexit, I would say, look, we're out of the EU. That's it. The fact that the Prime Minister wants to have close relations with France and Germany, it's not a betrayal of Brexit. And that's another thing I dislike about Reform. Yes, I voted to stay in the EU. I'm not a lover of the EU, but I'm not convinced that Brexit is as wonderful as it was made out to be. Um, and that's the point with Reform. They're just anti-EU. I honestly think Reform sees the EU as a bigger threat than Russia, and that is pathetic. That is an absolutely absurd way of looking at the world. So obviously, as someone who voted Remain, I'm not going to be in a rush to vote for a party like Reform. Nigel Farage, if Reform doesn't do as well as they think, is he going to just form another party? And that's yet another thing about Reform. It's a one-man party. I mean, you think Reform, you think Nigel Farage. That could be good in a sense. Having a big personality can be a vote winner, but it also means that there's egos at play. And I think there's very real tensions in Reform ranks between Farage and some of his colleagues. I think that if they can't even handle five MPs, if they're already in civil war, how are they going to handle government? That's my views on Reform. Let me know your thoughts. I know some people will disagree, but I'm just speaking candidly here how I feel about it.